The auction house smelled of dust and dying flowers, and the quiet desperation of people selling things they loved. Rowena Ashwick stood at the back of the room with her gloved hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached beneath the leather, watching a stranger hold up her mother's pearl necklace to the light. The pearls caught the gray London afternoon, filtering through the tall windows, and glowed with the soft warmth of something that remembered being treasured. 40 years those pearls had lived against her mother's throat. Every Sunday, every birthday, every Christmas morning, when Margot Ashwick would come downstairs in her best dress, and her husband would say, as if seeing her for the first time, "There she is." Now a man with ink-stained fingers and a bored expression was assigning them a lot number. Rowena should not have come. Jasper had told her not to. Her brother had handled all the arrangements with the auction house himself, and he had been very clear that watching their family's belongings be catalogued and priced and scattered to strangers was not something she needed to witness. But Jasper handled things the way he always handled things, which was to say with optimistic vagueness and the cheerful conviction that everything would work out. And Rowena had learned years ago that someone in the Ashwick family needed to pay attention to the details. So here she was, paying attention, trying not to cry. The auctioneer's assistant moved to the next item, a writing desk of polished walnut that had belonged to her father. Edwin Ashwick had written every one of his letters at that desk, had kept his accounts there, and had sat behind it on the evening he told his children that his business partner had vanished with everything. The desk still had a ring on its surface from a cup of tea her father had set down the night the constables came. Rowena had tried to polish it out when she was 14. It never came out. She had stopped trying. "Lot 47, the assistant said, not looking up. "Writing desk, walnut, circa 1800, some surface damage. Starting bid, £4. £4. Her father's entire working life reduced to £4. Rowena turned away and nearly collided with a man standing directly behind her. He was tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed in a way that made him look entirely wrong in this room of second-hand furniture and faded hope. His coat was cut with the kind of precision that cost more than everything in the auction combined. His eyes were blue and cool and fixed on her with an expression she could not read. He looked perhaps 30, and he carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone who had never once been told no. "Forgive me," Rowena said automatically, stepping aside. He did not move. He was studying her face with an attention that felt almost clinical, as if she were a problem he was trying to solve. Then his gaze dropped to the auction catalog in her hands, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, though not of her. Recognition of something else. The situation, perhaps. The quiet mathematics of ruin. "These are your family's belongings," he said. It was not a question. "I beg your pardon?" "The catalog." He nodded toward it. "You've marked certain lots. The pearls, the desk, the landscape painting by the door. You're not here to buy. You're here to watch them go." Rowena felt heat climb her neck. The observation was precise and delivered without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Cruelty she could have deflected. Accuracy left her nowhere to hide. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said, letting frost enter her voice. "We haven't." His gaze returned to her face. "But I know who you are, Miss Ashwick." The use of her name stopped her cold. She had never seen this man before in her life. She was certain of it. She would have remembered. "You have the advantage of me, sir." "Caius Wyndham," he said, as if the name should mean something. It did. It meant everything. Wyndham, the Duke of Thornfield, one of the wealthiest men in England, and, more relevantly, the man whose family had once owned the Ashwick estate. The Wyndhams had sold the land to Rowena's grandfather 60 years ago in a transaction that everyone in society knew about and no one discussed, because the details were complicated and the implications were worse. except that Rowena's father had spent his final years insisting the original sale had been fraudulent, that the land had been entailed through a maternal line the Wyndhams had quietly erased from the records, and when Edwin Ashwick had tried to prove it, his business partner had disappeared with every document that mattered. Her father had died, still believing he was right. The world had dismissed him as a ruined man chasing conspiracies, and now his daughter was standing in an auction house, watching his furniture be sold, face to face with the grandson of the man he'd accused. "Your Grace," Rowena said carefully, "I was not aware you frequented auction houses." "I don't." He glanced around the room with an expression that confirmed it. "I came to find you." The words landed like a stone in still water. Rowena felt every nerve in her body go taut. "I cannot imagine why. Because I have a proposition, and I'm told you're the only person in London stubborn enough to be useful to me." Rowena stared at him. The sheer presumption of the statement left her momentarily speechless, which she suspected was intentional. Men like Caius Wyndham did not say things by accident. They deployed words the way generals deployed cavalry, with precision and an expectation of immediate effect. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the low murmur of the auction room, bright and breathless and entirely out of place. "Caius, you found her." "Oh, thank heavens. I told you she'd be here. Didn't I tell you?" A young woman appeared at the Duke's elbow, perhaps 19 or 20, with the same dark hair, but none of his composure. She had the look of someone who found life genuinely delightful and could not understand why everyone else insisted on being so serious about it. She seized both of Rowena's hands before anyone could manage introductions. "You must be Miss Ashwick. I'm L'Oreal, his sister. Please ignore everything about his manner. He's appalling with people, but he means well underneath all that frost. Usually. Sometimes. The point is, we need your help." "L'Oreal," the Duke said, in the tone of someone who had said that name in exactly that tone several thousand times before. "Don't L'Oreal me. You've been circling this for weeks. Just tell her." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked at Rowena with those cool blue eyes, and she had the sudden, unsettling feeling that she was standing at the edge of something she did not yet understand. "My grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, has decided I must marry this season. Her preferred candidate is Lady Clarice Dunmore. Suitable, well-connected, entirely appropriate by every measure society recognizes. I have no intention of marrying Lady Clarice, or anyone else. But my grandmother is relentless, and Lady Clarice believes we have an understanding that I have never agreed to." Rowena waited, not understanding what this had to do with her. "I need someone to occupy the position," he continued. "Someone who can appear as a credible alternative. Someone intelligent enough to navigate the season without making errors, and unknown enough to disappear when the arrangement ends. Your name was suggested to me by a man called Dermot Selkirk, who I believe handles your brother's business affairs." Rowena's stomach dropped. Dermot. Of course. Jasper's perpetually scheming associate, always looking for the next arrangement, the next opportunity, the next way to profit from other people's problems. She was going to kill her brother. "Mr. Selkirk does not speak for me," she said flatly. "No. But he described your situation accurately. Your family is facing financial ruin. This auction will not cover your debts. Your brother's investments have failed. Your mother takes in needlework. Your father died believing he'd been cheated, and no one listened." The Duke paused. "I'm offering you a way out, Miss Ashwick. Not permanently, but long enough to change your circumstances." The clinical recitation of her family's humiliation should have made her furious. It did make her furious. But underneath the fury was something worse. The sick recognition that every word he'd said was true. "And what precisely would I be required to do?" she asked, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "Live at Thornfield House for the season as my sister's guest and companion." Attend the expected social events. Allow society to believe I am courting you. When the season ends and my grandmother relents, we part ways amicably, and you leave with references and connections that will secure your future. You want me to pretend to be your romantic interest to avoid marrying someone else. I want you to solve a problem. He said it as if discussing estate management, not courtship. Romance is incidental. L'Oreal made a face behind her brother's back that suggested she disagreed with this assessment entirely. Rowena said nothing. She was aware of the auction continuing behind them. The low hum of bids and lot numbers. The sound of her family's possessions being valued and claimed and carried away. Somewhere in that room, her mother's pearls were being held up to the light by someone who did not know what they meant. She thought about what it would mean to say yes, to enter the world her father had believed had cheated him, to wear borrowed clothes and perform a version of herself that didn't exist. And she thought about what it would mean to say no, to go home and tell her mother the auction had raised less than they owed, to begin the slow arithmetic of what they could sell next. Rowena looked at the auction room around her, at the strangers pawing through her family's history, at the writing desk where her father had sat, broken and disbelieved. She thought of her mother at home, squinting at needlework by candlelight because they could not afford enough lamps. She thought of Jasper, who meant well, but whose optimism was a kind of blindness. She thought of her father, who had gone to his grave calling the Wyndham's thieves. And now, a Wyndham was standing in front of her, offering her shelter in exchange for performance. The irony was enough to choke on. 3 conditions, she heard herself say. The Duke's eyebrow rose fractionally. You're negotiating. You need me, Your Grace. That was apparent the moment you walked into an auction house in Cheapside, wearing a coat that costs more than this entire room. Whatever leverage I have, I intend to use it. You should know that about me now. L'Oreal clasped her hands together with barely contained delight. Something shifted in the Duke's expression. Not warmth, not exactly, but the beginning of interest, the way a man might look at a chess opponent who had just made an unexpected move. Name them, he said. First, my family is told I've accepted a position as Lady L'Oreal's companion. Nothing about courtship or arrangement. A respectable explanation, delivered properly, not through Dermot Selkirk. Done. Second, when this ends, I leave with letters of introduction that will help me secure a position as a governess or companion. Real letters, from real people, with real weight behind them. I won't go back to where I am now. L'Oreal stepped forward. I'll do better than letters. I'll introduce you to every family I know. You'll have your choice of positions. And third, the Duke asked. Rowena met his eyes directly. At no point during this arrangement will my father's claims about the Wyndham estate be used against me. I know what he believed. I know what your family says about it. But I won't have it weaponized. Not by you. Not by your grandmother. Not by anyone in your household. If you want me to play this role, you accept that my father's name stays out of it. The silence between them stretched taut as wire. Rowena could feel her heart hammering, but she held his gaze without flinching. She had learned that trick from her father. Look them in the eye, he used to say. The ones who look away first are the ones with something to hide. The Duke did not look away. You have my word, he said. All 3 conditions. He extended his hand. Rowena looked at it. Long fingers, strong grip, the hand of a man who controlled vast estates, and answered to no one except, apparently, a grandmother he could not outmaneuver. She took it. His grip was firm and brief, and when he released her, the auction room felt different. Smaller, somehow, as if the walls had drawn in around a decision she could not take back. The carriage is outside, L'Oreal said, already moving toward the door. We can collect your things this afternoon and have you settled at Thornfield House by evening. This afternoon, Rowena repeated. My grandmother moves quickly, the Duke said. We need to move faster." Rowena looked one last time at the auction room, at the pearls, at the desk, at the landscape her father had loved. Then she turned her back on all of it and followed a duke and his sister out into the gray London street. She did not know yet what she had agreed to. She only knew that for the first time in years, the ground beneath her feet felt less like sinking and more like the beginning of a fall, fast and terrifying and aimed at something she could not yet see. And somewhere behind her, in the auction room she had just left, her father's writing desk was sold to a stranger for £6. £2 more than the starting bid. She did not hear the gavel fall, but she felt it. The way you feel a door close in a room you will never enter again. The carriage was the most beautiful enclosed space Rowena had ever occupied, which was precisely the problem. She sat on upholstered velvet the color of midnight, watching London pass through windows framed in polished brass, and tried to reconcile the last 2 hours with the rest of her life. This morning she had been counting stitches and pennies over her mother's mending basket. Now she was riding through Mayfair in a duke's private carriage, while his sister chatted beside her as if they had known each other for years. Caius sat across from them, silent, his gaze fixed on the streets outside. L'Oreal filled the silence for both of them. "You'll need everything," L'Oreal was saying, ticking items off on her fingers. "Morning dresses, walking dresses, evening gowns. 3 ball gowns at minimum. Gloves, slippers, shawls. I'll send word to Madame Renaud this afternoon. She's extraordinary. She once made me a gown in 2 days for the Pemberton Assembly when I spilled claret on my original." "This is too much," Rowena said, the words escaping before she could frame them more diplomatically. "Nonsense. You're my companion for the season. Appearances must be maintained. It's not the appearances that concern me, it's the cost." L'Oreal waved a hand, as if cost were a concept she had heard of, but never personally encountered. "Caius is paying for everything. He can afford it. He owns half of Derbyshire." "Caius," the Duke said quietly, without looking away from the window, "would prefer not to be discussed, as though he were absent." Then Caius should contribute to the conversation, instead of brooding attractively against the squabs. Rowena almost smiled. Almost. But the weight of what she had just done pressed too heavily for humor to take hold. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the houses grow larger and grander as the carriage moved deeper into Mayfair, each one a monument to the kind of wealth that made her family's ruin feel not just painful, but obscene. When the carriage stopped, her breath left her. Thornfield House was not merely large, it was a statement. Cream stone and tall windows, a columned entrance that rose 2 stories, wrought iron railings that gleamed as if someone polished them every morning, which, Rowena realized, someone almost certainly did. Servants appeared before the carriage door was fully open, hands reaching, voices murmuring, the entire household moving with the oiled efficiency of a machine designed to serve. "The blue guest suite," the Duke told the housekeeper, a thin woman with steel-gray hair and an expression of permanent competence. "Have it prepared immediately. Miss Ashwick will also require a lady's maid." "Of course, Your Grace." The housekeeper's eyes flicked to Rowena. Brief assessment. No judgment visible. "I'll send Nell up directly." The entrance hall alone was larger than the Ashwick cottage. Rowena stood on marble floors and looked up at a ceiling painted with clouds and classical figures, and felt, with absolute certainty, that she was a fraud. Every step she took in this house would be a lie. Every conversation, every smile, every moment she pretended to belong would be another thread in a deception that would eventually unravel and leave her exactly where she started, only with the added humiliation of having briefly pretended otherwise. "Your rooms," L'Oreal said gently, taking her arm. "Come, I'll show you." The blue guest suite was named for the pale silk wallpaper that covered every surface, the color of a winter sky just before snow. The bed was enormous, canopied in cream linen, piled with pillows that looked like they had never been disturbed. A writing desk stood by the window, smaller than her father's, but made of wood so fine it seemed to glow. The attached sitting room had its own fireplace, already lit. It was the most beautiful room Rowena had ever seen, and it made her want to weep. A knock at the door. A young woman entered, perhaps Rowena's own age, with copper-colored hair pulled back under a cap, and an expression of nervous friendliness. "Miss Ashwick, I'm Nell. I've been assigned as your lady's maid." She held up a tray. "I brought tea. And some of Cook's shortbread. I thought you might be hungry, what with everything being so sudden." The small kindness undid something in Rowena's chest. She swallowed hard. "Thank you, Nell. That's very thoughtful." L'Oreal squeezed her hand at the door. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we plan." And Rowena, she hesitated, then smiled. "I know this is strange, all of it, but I'm glad you're here. This house has been so heavy since Father died. Grandmother grieving through control, Caius grieving through silence. It needs someone new, someone real." She left, and Rowena was alone in her borrowed room, drinking borrowed tea, sitting on borrowed furniture, wrapped in a borrowed life. She set down the cup and moved to the window. The gardens below were immaculate, paths of pale gravel winding between hedges, shaped with mathematical precision. In the far corner, she could see a figure standing very still among the topiaries. The Duke. His hands were clasped behind his back, his face turned upward toward the darkening sky. He looked like a man standing guard over something he had already lost. Rowena turned away from the window, unpinned her hair, and climbed into a bed softer than anything she had ever imagined. She should have been terrified. She should have been planning, calculating, preparing for whatever the morning would bring. Instead, she lay in the dark and thought about the way the Duke had said your father's claims, as if the words were a door he had deliberately closed. Not denied, not dismissed, just closed. And she wondered, with a sharpness that would not let her sleep, what was on the other side. The Dowager Duchess of Thornfield descended the main staircase at precisely 10 o'clock the following morning, with the measured authority of a woman who had spent 50 years bending the world to her preferences, and saw no reason to stop now. She was smaller than Rowena expected, silver-haired, sharp-featured, dressed in black bombazine that she wore like armor rather than mourning. Her eyes were the same blue as her grandson's, but harder, polished by decades of watching people disappoint her and being proven right about it every time. "So," the Dowager said, stopping 3 steps from the bottom so that she looked down at Rowena from a height advantage she had clearly calculated. "You are the girl from the auction house." Rowena curtsied, drawing on every lesson her mother had ever drilled into her about posture and deportment. The Ashwicks might have lost their money. They had not lost their manners. "Your Grace, I apologize for the unconventional circumstances of my arrival." Unconventional. The Dowager repeated the word as if tasting it, and finding it insufficient. "My grandson brings an unknown woman into this house without warning, installs her in the guest suite, and announces she will be his sister's companion for the season. Unconventional is generous, Miss Ashwick." Behind Rowena, she could feel L'Oreal tensing. From somewhere down the corridor, she heard what might have been the Duke's study door opening. "I won't insult you by pretending this is anything other than what it is, Your Grace." The Dowager's expression shifted, barely perceptible, but there. A fractional narrowing of the eyes that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of interest. "And what is it?" "Your grandson has offered me a temporary arrangement. I accepted it because my family's situation is desperate, and I saw no better option. I'm under no illusion about what I am to this household. A useful disruption. Nothing more." Silence. L'Oreal had stopped breathing, The Dowager studied Rowena the way one might study a document suspected of being either very valuable or very dangerous. "Come with me," the Dowager said. "Alone." She led Rowena to a small sitting room at the back of the house, furnished in dark green silk and heavy mahogany. The door closed behind them with a sound like a verdict. "Sit," the Dowager said, pointing to a chair positioned directly across from her own, close enough that there would be nowhere to hide. Rowena sat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. "Tell me who you really are." It was not a request. It was a command issued by a woman who had spent a lifetime receiving answers. Rowena considered, for exactly 1 second, the option of evasion. Then she discarded it. This woman would detect a lie the way a hound detects a fox, by instinct and with relentless pursuit. "My father was Edwin Ashwick. He was a merchant who built a successful import business from nothing. He was brilliant, everyone said so. He had a partner called Garrett Selkirk, Dermot's father, who handled the finances while my father handled the trade. When I was 12, Garrett Selkirk vanished overnight, with every penny the business had earned over 15 years. My father was left with debts he could not pay, and a reputation he could not repair." The Dowager listened without expression. He spent the rest of his life trying to prove that the theft was connected to a larger fraud, one that went back decades. He believed that the land his family had purchased from your family 60 years ago had been sold under false pretenses, that the entailment records had been altered, that the Ashwicks had paid for something the Wyndhams had no legal right to sell. "And do you believe that?" the Dowager asked, her voice giving nothing away. Rowena met her eyes. "I believe my father was an honest man who spent his life chasing a truth no one wanted to hear. Whether he was right about the details, I cannot say. But he was not mad, and he was not a liar, and I will not sit in your house and pretend otherwise. Not even for shelter." The Dowager was silent for a long time. Outside the window, a clock struck the quarter hour. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its interrogative edge and taken on something more complex. "Your father's accusations caused my family considerable difficulty," she said. "My late son, Caius's father, spent years dealing with solicitors and counterclaims and the whispering of people who found the story entertaining. It took a toll on his health. He was never a strong man." Rowena's stomach tightened. "I'm sorry for that, Your Grace. My father never intended to cause harm. He only wanted the truth acknowledged." "The truth." The Dowager said the word carefully, as if it were something breakable. "Let me tell you what I see, Miss Ashwick. I see the daughter of a man who accused my family of fraud, sitting in my house, wearing a dress that has been mended 3 times at the sleeve, accepting my grandson's protection. If I were inclined toward suspicion, I might call that a strategy. If you were inclined toward fairness," Rowena said, her voice quiet but steady, "you might call it desperation. I did not seek your grandson out. He found me. I did not ask for this arrangement. He offered it. And I accepted it because the alternative was watching my mother's pearls sold to strangers and going home to tell her there was nothing left." Something moved behind the Dowager's eyes. Not softness exactly. This woman did not appear to traffic in softness, but recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement of one form of strength by another. "My grandson does not want to marry," the Dowager said abruptly, changing direction. "He has not wanted anything since his father died. He manages the estates, attends Parliament, fulfills every obligation his title demands, and feels nothing while doing it. He is perfectly competent and perfectly empty. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Rowena hesitated. "You want him to marry because you want him to feel something again." The Dowager's jaw tightened. "I want him to live. Lady Clarice Dunmore is everything a duchess should be. Beautiful, connected, wealthy. She is also profoundly dull, and she would bore him into an early grave. But she is suitable, and suitability is the only language my grandson currently speaks. Then why not let me serve my purpose? Rowena asked. Let me occupy the space, deflect Lady Clarice, give him the breathing room he apparently needs. When the season ends, I'll go. The Dowager leaned forward. Because arrangements have a way of becoming complicated, Miss Ashwick, and complicated arrangements in this house tend to hurt the people I love. She stood, moving to the window, her back straight as a blade. Her hands gripped the window frame, and for one unguarded moment, Rowena saw the tension in her knuckles, the effort of holding everything together through sheer will. My son died 8 months ago, the Dowager said. A fever that took hold so quickly, we barely had time to understand what was happening. Caius was in the north, managing the Thornfield country estate. He rode through the night, but he was 4 hours too late. He walked into his father's bedroom and found it empty. The servants had already changed the sheets. Rowena's throat closed. He has not spoken about it. Not once. Not to me, not to L'Oreal, not to anyone. He simply absorbed it the way he absorbs everything, silently and completely, and continued functioning as if nothing had changed. But everything changed. The Dowager turned back, her expression restored to its usual severity. But Rowena had seen what lay beneath it, and she would not forget. I will not oppose your presence in this house, the Dowager said. You have spine, which is more than most of the vapid creatures my grandson encounters. But understand this clearly. If you cause him pain, if you exploit his grief, if you use your father's claims to manipulate this family in any way, I will ensure that every door in England closes to you permanently. We understand each other? Perfectly, Your Grace. The Dowager nodded once and moved toward the door. Then she paused, one hand on the frame. Your mother's pearls, she said. Lot 12 in the auction catalog. My agent purchased them yesterday on my instructions. They will be returned to you before the end of the week. She left before Rowena could respond, which was fortunate because Rowena could not have responded. She stood in the green sitting room with her hand pressed to her mouth and tears running down her face, shaking with the force of an emotion she could not name. Gratitude and grief and confusion and the dawning, terrifying realization that nothing about this arrangement was going to be as simple as she had told herself it would be. When she finally emerged, she found L'Oreal waiting in the corridor, bouncing on her toes. She likes you, L'Oreal whispered. I can tell because she made you cry. She only bothers making people cry when she thinks they're worth the effort. That is a deeply alarming method of showing approval, Rowena said, wiping her eyes. Welcome to the Wyndhams. L'Oreal linked her arm through Rowena's and steered her toward the morning room, already chattering about dress fittings and social calendars, and which families to charm and which to avoid. Behind them, through the sitting room window, Rowena caught a glimpse of the Duke in the garden again, standing in exactly the same spot as last night, his hands behind his back, his face turned toward nothing. Not performing his duties, she thought, borrowing the Dowager's phrase. Not really here. She wondered what it would take to reach him, and then she told herself firmly that it was not her concern. This was temporary. A transaction. A performance with a predetermined ending. She repeated the word as L'Oreal led her deeper into the house, into the borrowed life that was already beginning to feel less borrowed and more like something she might, against every rational instinct, begin to want. Temporary, she told herself, but even she did not believe it. The first 4 days at Thornfield House passed in a blur of silk and strategy. L'Oreal had commandeered the operation with the focus of a field marshal. Madame Renaud arrived on the second morning with 2 assistants and enough fabric samples to furnish a small theater. Rowena stood on a low platform in the morning room, while the modista circled her with measuring tape, murmuring observations in accented English that seemed directed at no one and everyone simultaneously. Good bones, Madame Renaud said. pinning a length of dove-gray muslin against Rowena's shoulder. Excellent carriage. You hold yourself like someone who was taught to stand properly and never forgot. The sapphire silk for the Latimer ball, I think. It will make her look like she has always belonged in rooms like these. She has, L'Oreal said from the settee, where she was surrounded by fashion plates. She just hasn't had the wardrobe to prove it. Rowena said nothing. She was thinking about her mother, who had drilled deportment and elocution into both her children with the quiet ferocity of a woman who understood that grace was the one thing poverty could not take from you. Between fittings, L'Oreal coached her. The Latimer ball was in 6 days. The intelligence she supplied was precise and delivered with the cheerful ruthlessness of someone who found social warfare genuinely entertaining. Lady Hartwell is an ally. Her husband served with our father in Parliament, and she's sentimental about the family. Flatter her garden. She's obsessed with her roses. Lord Edgerton is harmless, but we'll talk about his horses for an hour if you let him. Cut him off after 10 minutes by mentioning the weather. The Sinclair sisters are gossips, but not malicious. Feed them something small and true, and they'll leave you alone. And Lady Clarice Dunmore. L'Oreal paused, her brightness dimming by 1 degree. Lady Clarice is beautiful, rich, perfectly mannered, and she believes she is going to be the next Duchess of Thornfield. Grandmother has been encouraging that belief for months. Clarice's mother and grandmother were close friends. The families have always assumed the match would happen eventually. When you walk into that ballroom on Caius's arm, you are not simply arriving. You are detonating an expectation that has been building for a generation. Rowena absorbed this, and Lady Clarice herself. What is she like? L'Oreal considered. She is the kind of woman who is never wrong, because she never says anything interesting enough to be tested. She is polished and pleasant and utterly without depth. She will smile at you and mean nothing by it, and she will destroy you if she can, and mean nothing by that either. Do not underestimate her. Through all of this, the Duke remained absent. He appeared at meals, arriving precisely on time, contributing exactly as much conversation as courtesy required, and departing the moment the last course was cleared. He was unfailingly polite to Rowena. He asked if her rooms were comfortable. He inquired whether L'Oreal was being helpful. He expressed hope that Madame Renaud's work was satisfactory. Each exchange was perfectly correct and perfectly hollow, like speaking to a portrait that had been trained to respond. On the 4th evening, Rowena found him in the library. She had been looking for something to read, because the blue guest suite was too quiet after dark, and her thoughts became dangerous without occupation. The library was vast, 2 stories of shelves rising toward a ceiling painted with constellations, a fire burning low in the grate. The Duke was seated at a desk near the far wall, surrounded by papers. He did not look up. "I can leave," she said. "Stay." The word was spoken without inflection, as if her presence or absence were equally irrelevant. "I'm reviewing the quarterly accounts. It requires no concentration." That seemed unlikely, but Rowena did not argue. She moved to the nearest shelf and let her fingers drift along the spines. Philosophy, history, poetry. The library of a family that had valued knowledge for generations. "Your father's?" she asked. "Mostly." He read widely. He believed a duke who only read about duking was not worth the title. She almost smiled. It was the most human thing the Duke had said to her. She pulled a volume of Cowper from the shelf and settled into one of the leather chairs. For several minutes, the only sounds were the scratch of his pen, the shift of coals in the grate, and the turning of pages. Then, without looking up, "You're watching me. I'm observing." A pause. "Is there a distinction?" "Watching is idle," Rowena said. "Observing is intentional. I observe because I'm trying to understand what I've walked into, and you are the least transparent person I have ever encountered." He set down his pen, not with irritation, but with the careful deliberateness of a man who was deciding whether to engage or withdraw. When he turned to face her, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something that had not been there before. Attention. Real attention, not the courteous performance he deployed at meals. "What have you observed?" he asked. "That you work constantly, that you eat without tasting your food, that you speak to your sister with affection, but never let the conversation go deeper than pleasantries, that you stand in the garden every evening at the same time, in the same spot, looking at nothing, that your grandmother is terrified for you, and you either cannot see it or will not." The silence that followed was so absolute, she could hear the clock ticking in the hallway outside. "My grandmother," the Duke said slowly, "is terrified of very little. She's terrified of losing you the way she lost your father. Not to death, to disappearance. You're still here, but you've left." He stared at her. Rowena held his gaze and waited for the dismissal, for the cold authority to return, for him to remind her that she was a temporary fixture in his household, and her observations were neither requested nor welcome. Instead, he said, "You speak very freely for someone in your position. You hired me to be convincing, Your Grace. Convincing requires understanding, and understanding requires honesty. If you wanted someone who would sit quietly and never look too closely, you should have hired someone with less to lose. I cannot afford to misread this situation." Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth. Not yet. But the first crack in something that had been sealed, shut for a long time. "My father used to say that honesty was the only luxury worth having," he said. He leaned back in his chair, the quarterly accounts forgotten. "Tell me about your family. Beyond what you told my grandmother. If we are to be convincing, I should know the details." It was practical, strategic, entirely transactional. So Rowena could not explain, even to herself, why it felt like an invitation. She spoke carefully at first, then with growing ease. She told him about her mother's resilience, the way Margot Ashwick could make a room feel warm with nothing but conversation and candlelight. About Jasper's unshakable optimism, how he woke every morning believing today would be the day something finally worked. About her father's brilliance, the way Edwin Ashwick could look at a shipping manifest and see patterns no one else could see, and how that same brilliance had turned inward after the betrayal, becoming obsession, becoming the endless chase for proof that no one wanted him to find. She did not mention the entailment. She did not mention the fraud claims. She held to her third condition like a rope over a chasm. The Duke listened without interrupting. When she finished, the fire had burned to embers, and the library was lit only by the 2 candles on his desk. "Your father sounds like a man who deserved better than he received," the Duke said. The words were simple. They were also the first time anyone outside her family had spoken about Edwin Ashwick without pity or dismissal, and they hit Rowena with a force she was not prepared for. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and returned his attention to the ledger, but the dismissal felt different now. Less like a wall, and more like a door that had been opened 1 inch and left ajar. "The ball is in 2 days," he said without looking up. "We should discuss what to expect. You'll be introduced as L'Oreal's companion and friend. I'll ask you to dance the first waltz. We'll be seen speaking throughout the evening, enough to suggest interest but not enough to invite scandal. And Lady Clarice?" His pen stopped. "She'll be there. My grandmother will see to that. You should expect questions, judgment, and possibly open hostility. I've survived worse than hostility, Your Grace." He looked up then, and for one unguarded moment, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not admiration, not exactly, but recognition. The look of a man who had just discovered that the person across from him was more than he had calculated for. "Yes," he said quietly. "I expect you have." Rowena left the library carrying the Cowper volume and a feeling in her chest that she could not name. It sat below her ribs like a second heartbeat, persistent and warm and entirely unwelcome. This is temporary, she reminded herself on the stairs. But the word was beginning to sound less like a fact, and more like a prayer she was losing faith in. The sapphire gown fit as if Madame Renaud had somehow taken the measure of not just her body, but her ambitions. Rowena stood before the looking-glass in the blue guest suite and barely recognized herself. The silk caught the candlelight and held it, shimmering with every breath. Nell had arranged her dark hair in a style that was elegant, without being elaborate, pinned with a single silver comb that L'Oreal had pressed into her hands that afternoon, with the words, "It was my mother's," and she would have wanted someone to actually wear it instead of keeping it in a drawer. The pearls were at her throat. Her mother's pearls, returned by the dowager's agent 2 days ago in a velvet box with no note attached. Rowena had held them for a long time before putting them on, feeling the weight of everything they carried. Her mother's laughter, her father's pride, the life they had lost, and the strange, borrowed life she was living now. "You look beautiful," Nell said from behind her, then caught herself. You look very suitable, miss. Very appropriate." "Beautiful is fine, Nell." Rowena turned from the mirror. "I may never wear anything this exquisite again. I intend to enjoy the word while it applies." L'Oreal appeared in the doorway in pale gold silk and gasped with theatrical conviction. "Caius is going to swallow his tongue. Caius is going to behave exactly as he always does," Rowena said, which is to say, impeccably and without visible emotion. She was wrong. They met him in the entrance hall, where he stood in dark, formal evening wear that made him look like a man carved from authority and shadow. Rowena watched his gaze move from L'Oreal to her, and she saw the moment it caught. A fractional pause, the slightest hesitation in his breathing. His eyes traveled from the silver comb to the pearls to the sapphire silk and back to her face, and something crossed his expression that he suppressed so quickly she might have imagined it. Except she did not imagine it. She had spent 4 days learning to read this man, and what she had just seen was not indifference. "The gown suits you," he said. His voice was perfectly controlled. L'Oreal kicked his ankle, which Rowena was beginning to understand was a family tradition. "What my brother means," L'Oreal said sweetly, "is that you look stunning, and he is experiencing human emotions about it." The dowager descended last, in black silk and jet beads that made her look like a queen presiding over a military campaign. She examined Rowena for exactly 3 seconds. "Acceptable," she pronounced, and swept toward the carriage. The Latimer ball blazed with candles and expectation. Music poured from the ballroom in golden waves. Rowena felt her courage waver at the entrance, aware of eyes tracking their arrival, whispered calculations beginning before she had taken 3 steps. "Steady," the Duke murmured beside her, his hand at the small of her back. "Remember, tonight you belong here." She did not belong here, but she lifted her chin and walked as her mother had taught her. The introductions were relentless. Lady Hartwell and her roses, Lord Edgerton and his horses, the Sinclair sisters extracting details with cheerful persistence. And then Lady Clarice arrived. She was exquisite. Pale blonde hair arranged to perfection, a gown of rose-pink silk that probably cost more than the Ashwick cottage, skin like cream, and eyes like a winter pond, pretty on the surface and cold underneath. She moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had never questioned whether she belonged anywhere, because the answer had always been yes. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying to the Duke with the precise depth that conveyed both deference and possession. "How lovely to see you again. And this must be Miss Ashwick, L'Oreal's friend, is it?" The pause before friend was surgical, a scalpel wrapped in silk. "Lady Clarice," Rowena replied, matching her smile exactly. "What a beautiful gown. Pink is clearly your color. How kind. I had it made in Paris. One does try to maintain certain standards." She turned to the Duke as if Rowena had already ceased to exist. "I hope you'll save me a dance, Your Grace. We have so much to discuss. Your grandmother was just telling my mother about the most wonderful plans for the summer." "My card is rather full this evening," the Duke said. The words were polite, but the temperature around them dropped several degrees. "Surely you can find room." Lady Clarice's smile did not falter, but something sharpened behind her eyes. "For an old friend." "I'm sure we'll speak later, Lady Clarice," the Duke said, in a tone that made it clear they would not. She withdrew with perfect grace, but Rowena caught the look she cast backward, a look that said, "This is not over," with absolute clarity. The orchestra struck up a waltz. The Duke turned to her and extended his hand. "I believe this is ours." Rowena had practiced with the dancing master L'Oreal had hired, a small, fierce Frenchman who shouted instructions as if lives depended on proper footwork. But practice had not prepared her for this. The Duke's hand at her waist, her gloved palm pressed against his, the weight of 100 watching gazes as they moved onto the floor. "Stop counting," he said quietly as they began to move. "I'm not counting." "You are. Your lips are moving." She almost laughed, and the near laughter broke something loose in her. She stopped thinking about steps and let the music carry her, let his lead guide her through the turns. He danced the way he did everything, with controlled precision. But there was something beneath the control tonight, a tension in his hand at her waist, an awareness in his eyes that had not been there before. They moved together with a fluency that surprised them both. The room blurred. The candles streaked. For a few suspended minutes, there was nothing but the music and the motion and the strange, frightening intimacy of moving in perfect unison with someone who was supposed to be a business arrangement. "Everyone is watching," she whispered. "Good," he said. "That's the point." But his hand tightened at her waist as he said it, and the gesture felt nothing like strategy. The waltz ended. He released her with precise formality, bowing over her hand. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Ashwick. The pleasure was mine, Your Grace. They were performing." She knew that. He knew that. Everyone watching knew that. But when his fingers left hers, she felt the absence like a small, private wound. And she saw, just for an instant, the same flicker of loss cross his face before the mask slid back into place. The rest of the evening unfolded in careful maneuvers. L'Oreal stayed close, whispering guidance. The Duke remained within sight, not hovering, but watchful. When Lord Egerton cornered her, the Duke appeared with a murmured apology and an invented introduction. During the supper dance, they spoke of books. "Cowper or Wordsworth?" he asked. Cowper for truth, Wordsworth for beauty. They rarely overlap, and tonight? Which do you need? Tonight I feel as though I'm reading someone else's story and trying to guess how it ends. Something softened in his expression. Perhaps you should stop guessing and start writing it yourself. Before she could respond, the Dowager materialized with Lady Clarice in tow, her expression suggesting that she had not entirely abandoned her original plan, despite her promise not to oppose Rowena's presence. "Caius, you really must dance with Lady Clarice. She has been waiting all evening." The Duke looked at his grandmother, then at Lady Clarice, whose smile was bright and expectant, and edged with something harder underneath. Then at Rowena. "I'm afraid my card is full, grandmother. Surely one dance. For propriety's sake." Propriety would suggest that I dance with the companion I arrived with, not the woman I have repeatedly declined to court. The silence that followed was devastating. Lady Clarice's smile did not break, but it froze, and behind the freeze, Rowena saw real hurt, quickly buried. The Dowager's eyes went flat with displeasure. "Of course," Lady Clarice said, her voice perfectly even. "Perhaps another time." She turned and walked away, and the crowd parted for her, like water around a stone, and Rowena understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that Lady Clarice Dunmore was not simply a rival. She was a woman who had been told her entire life that this man would be hers, and she was watching that promise crumble in public, one dance at a time. Rowena almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She avoided the Duke for 2 days after the ball. It was not difficult. He seemed to be avoiding her in return, retreating into his study and his estate papers with renewed determination, appearing at meals with the punctual indifference of a clock striking the hour. They exchanged courtesies across the breakfast table. They passed in hallways with small nods. They did not return to the library. Rowena told herself this was appropriate. The ball had been a success. Society was speculating. Lady Clarice had been publicly set aside. The arrangement was functioning exactly as designed. So why did the distance feel wrong? On the third morning, Dermot Selkirk arrived. He was shown into the morning room where Rowena was attempting to read a novel L'Oreal had recommended, though she had been rereading the same paragraph for 15 minutes. "Miss Ashwick," Dermot said, bowing with an ease that suggested he'd practiced the gesture in a mirror. "You're looking remarkably well." "Wealth agrees with you." She closed the book. "Mr. Selkirk, I've been expecting you." He settled into a chair without being invited, which was characteristic. Dermot was perhaps 5 years older than Rowena, sharp-featured and quick-eyed, with the perpetual expression of a man calculating odds. His father had stolen the Ashwick fortune and vanished. Dermot had spent the years since trying to distance himself from that legacy, while simultaneously deploying the same talent for opportunism, just aimed at smaller targets. "Your brother sends his regards," Dermot said, "and his gratitude. Whatever the Duke is paying for this arrangement, Jasper considers himself well compensated." Rowena's jaw tightened. "How much, Dermot?" "I beg your pardon." "How much did my brother receive for offering me up to the Duke of Thornfield? I want the exact figure." Dermot had the grace to look uncomfortable, though only briefly. It was less an offering and more a mutual introduction. "Jasper mentioned your family's situation to me. I mentioned it to certain contacts. The Duke's people were already looking for someone with specific qualities. Educated, presentable, unconnected to society. You fit the requirements." "I fit the requirements," Rowena repeated flatly, like a horse meeting auction specifications. "I wouldn't put it quite so." "Yes, essentially. But look at the result. You're living in Mayfair, wearing sapphire silk, attending balls. In 3 months, you'll have connections that could set you up for life." He was not wrong. She hated that he was not wrong. "I need you to deliver something to my mother," she said, producing a sealed letter from her book. "And actually deliver it, Dermot. Don't get distracted by a more profitable errand along the way. You wound me. I know you. Take the letter, and tell Jasper I want to see him before the week is out. We need to discuss what he's agreed to on my behalf." Dermot took the letter and stood, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth, Miss Ashwick, I didn't do this to hurt you. Your father and mine had their differences, but I've always thought you deserved better than what life handed you. Then stop profiting from my circumstances and start acting like it." He left with a rueful smile that she suspected was genuine, which only made it more infuriating. She had barely recovered her composure when the Duke appeared in the doorway. He carried a flat package wrapped in brown paper, and his expression held something she had not seen before, a tension around the eyes that might have been uncertainty. "I saw Selkirk leaving," he said. "Did he disturb you?" "No more than his general existence disturbs me." Rowena set the novel aside. "Can I help you with something, Your Grace?" He entered the room and placed the package on the table between them. "I wanted to give you this." She unwrapped it carefully, folding back the brown paper to reveal a leather portfolio, old but beautifully maintained, embossed with initials she did not recognize. She opened it. Inside were documents, letters, contracts, surveyor's notes, all written in hands she did not know, and dated 60 years earlier. At the top of the first page, in ink that had faded from black to a deep amber, she read the words, "Deed of transfer, Ashwick Estate, from the Wyndham Family Trust." She stopped breathing. "These are from our family's archives," the Duke said. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the effort it cost him. "My father kept them locked in a separate cabinet in the library. I found them after his death, while sorting through his papers." Rowena stared at the documents. Her hands were trembling, and she could not make them stop. "These are the papers my father spent years looking for. Some of them. Not all. There are gaps, missing pages, documents that should exist but don't. I don't know what they prove or don't prove. But your father believed something was wrong with the original sale, and these suggest he may not have been entirely mistaken." The room tilted. Rowena gripped the edge of the table and forced herself to breathe. Her third condition. Her father's claims were not to be used against her. She had demanded that as protection, as a wall between her family's pain and this arrangement. She had not expected the Duke to walk through that wall voluntarily, carrying evidence. "Why?" she whispered. "Why give these to me?" "Because I found them in my father's private files. He kept them separate from the estate papers, hidden deliberately. I don't know why. I don't know what he intended to do with them. But I do know that your father asked for these documents repeatedly, through solicitors and through the courts, and was told they did not exist." He paused. "They existed. My family lied. The silence between them was immense. Rowena could hear her own pulse in her ears, could feel the weight of the leather portfolio beneath her fingers like a living thing, like a heart that had been beating in the dark for 60 years, waiting to be found. "This changes everything," she said. "It changes the past. It does not have to change the present. What you do with those documents is your decision, Miss Ashwick. I'm not giving them to you as part of our arrangement. I'm giving them to you because they belong to you, because my family should have surrendered them decades ago, and because your father deserved to be heard." Rowena looked up at him. The controlled facade was still there, the careful composure, the measured distance. But underneath it, for the first time, she saw something raw. Shame, perhaps, or the particular pain of discovering that the people you loved had done something unforgivable. "Your grandmother," Rowena said. "Does she know about these?" His jaw tightened. "No." "Your father?" "My father is dead. Whatever he knew, he took with him." They looked at each other across the morning room, and Rowena felt the entire architecture of their arrangement shift beneath her. This was no longer a transaction. This was no longer a performance. A man she had agreed to pretend to love had just handed her the means to destroy his family's reputation, freely and without conditions, because he believed it was right. She closed the portfolio carefully and pressed her palm flat against the leather. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she had ever meant anything. He nodded once, turned, and left the room quickly, as if staying would cost him something he could not afford to spend. Rowena sat alone with the documents and the ruins of her certainty, and tried to remember that this was supposed to be temporary. The word had never felt more like a lie. The Caulfield musical was smaller than the Latimer Ball, more intimate, which made it more dangerous. Rowena had spent 2 days reading the documents. What she found was incomplete, but damning. Letters between solicitors suggesting the entailment had been deliberately obscured. A surveyor's note referencing a maternal inheritance line absent from the official records. Fragments of a truth her father had spent his life chasing, scattered across 60 years of careful silence. She had not told the Duke what she found. The musical was polished, a quartet performing Handel in candlelight. Rowena was beginning to relax when she heard her name from a cluster of matrons near the refreshments. Ashwick, the merchant's daughter. Her father died raving about stolen land. Tragic, really. The apple never falls far. The Duke appeared beside her before the words had finished landing. "Walk with me," he said quietly. He led her through a side door into a conservatory. Glass walls, potted ferns, the smell of damp earth and green growing things. The music floated through, muted and distant. "You heard them," he said. "Everyone hears them. That's the point of saying it loudly." He was silent for a moment. "Then, I read my father's journals this week, after I gave you the documents. I wanted to understand what he knew." Rowena's breath stopped. He found the same gaps you'll find. The missing pages, the absent contracts. He wrote about them in his private diary. Dated entries, going back years. He was investigating quietly, without telling my grandmother. He believed the original sale was compromised. He was trying to find a way to make it right without destroying the family's reputation. "And then he died," Rowena said. "And then he died. And the investigation died with him, because I didn't know about it until I opened his desk and found papers I was never supposed to see." They stood among the ferns, the music floating through glass, and Rowena understood that this man had been carrying this knowledge alone for months. The grief of losing his father compounded by the discovery that his father had been hiding something. Shame and love tangled together in a knot he could not untie. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve the truth, and because I am tired of carrying it alone." He turned to face her, and his expression was stripped bare. No composure, no calculation, just exhaustion and honesty and something else, something that made her chest ache. "You make it easier to carry." Rowena felt the ground shift beneath her. This was the moment the arrangement ended, and something else began. She knew it. He knew it. The only question was whether either of them was brave enough to acknowledge it. "This is not what I agreed to," she whispered. "No." His voice was rough. "It isn't. I was supposed to be temporary." He stepped closer. His hand rose to her face, hesitated, then settled against her cheek with a gentleness that undid her completely. "You were never going to be temporary. I think I knew that the moment you told me to my face that I was the least transparent person you'd ever met. No one has spoken to me honestly in 8 months. You walked in and refused to do anything else." She should have stepped back. She should have reminded them both of the terms, the boundaries, the carefully negotiated conditions that were supposed to protect them from exactly this. Instead, she leaned into his hand and said, "I'm going to regret this." He kissed her. Not the formal gesture of the ball, controlled and public, and designed for witnesses. This was private. This was real. His mouth on hers, careful at first, then deeper, his hand sliding from her cheek to the back of her neck, drawing her closer. She gripped the lapels of his coat and felt the world narrow to the warmth of him and the impossible, terrifying certainty that nothing about her life would ever be the same. When they broke apart, breathing unevenly, reality reassembled itself around them in sharp fragments. "Tomorrow," he said. "Come to the library after breakfast. We need to discuss what happens next." Before she could answer, the conservatory door opened, and L'Oreal appeared, breathless and flushed. "There you are. Lady Clarice is looking for you, Caius. And Rowena, Mrs. Hartwell wants to discuss her roses again. I think she's genuinely trying to befriend you, which is either wonderful or alarming." They followed L'Oreal back to the drawing room, and Rowena tried to compose her expression into something that did not broadcast what had just happened between the ferns. She failed. She could feel it in the way her lips still tingled, in the way her hands would not stop trembling, in the way every nerve in her body was singing a song she had not asked to learn. Everything had changed, and everyone was watching. The library conversation never happened. Rowena came downstairs the next morning to find the breakfast table occupied by the Dowager, L'Oreal, and Lady Clarice Dunmore, who sat in a chair that should not have been hers, with the serene confidence of a woman who had been invited. She had not been invited by the Duke. The Dowager's expression made that clear enough. This was strategy, the old woman playing her final card. "Miss Ashwick," Lady Clarice said pleasantly. "How lovely. I was just telling the Dowager about the most wonderful dinner my mother is planning. An intimate gathering, just close friends of the family. We do so hope the Duke will attend." The word family landed with deliberate weight. Rowena was not family. She was a disruption, a temporary arrangement in a borrowed dress. Before Rowena could respond, the Duke entered. He saw Lady Clarice and stopped in the doorway, his expression, which had been open, almost alive, the most human she had seen it, shuddered instantly. "Lady Clarice," he said, "I wasn't aware we were expecting guests." "Your grandmother was kind enough to invite me for breakfast," Lady Clarice said. "I hope you don't mind. We have so much to discuss about the upcoming season. Mother is quite eager to formalize certain arrangements." The word formalize was a blade wrapped in silk. "There are no arrangements to formalize," the Duke said, his voice flat. "I have made my position clear, Lady Clarice." Repeatedly, the Dowager set down her teacup with a sound like a full stop. "Caius," she said, "sit down." He did not sit. He stood in the doorway, and Rowena watched the battle play out across his face, grief and duty and anger, and something new, something that looked like the beginning of defiance. "I will not marry Lady Clarice," he said. "I will not marry anyone my grandmother selects for me based on suitability alone. I have spent 8 months doing everything that was expected of me, managing the estates, attending Parliament, performing the role of Duke with the precision this family demands. But I will not perform a marriage, not to someone who makes me feel nothing." The silence was catastrophic. Lady Clarice's composure held, but only just. A faint color rose in her cheeks, and Rowena saw her fingers tighten around her teacup until the knuckles went white. The Dowager turned to Rowena. Her expression was ice. "This is your doing. I have done nothing, Your Grace, except what was asked of me. You have done exactly what I warned you not to do. You have made him hope. And hope, in a man who is still drowning in grief, is the cruelest thing you could have offered." The words struck with surgical precision because they were not entirely wrong. "You are a merchant's daughter," the Dowager continued. "Your father spent his last years accusing this family of theft. Your brother profits from your presence here. You have no fortune, no position, no future that does not depend on our continued charity. And now, my grandson believes he is in love with you because you are the first person who has looked at him since his father died and seen a man instead of a title." Each sentence was a nail driven through the exact center of every fear Rowena carried. "You're right," Rowena said. The room went still. "You're right about all of it. I don't belong here. I never did. My father's accusations, my family's circumstances, my entire presence in this house, it's all exactly as irregular as you say. And you're right that I've made him hope. I didn't mean to, but I did." She stood, and her voice was steady only because she had spent a lifetime learning to hold herself together in rooms where she was unwelcome. "I'll leave today." "Rowena," the Duke said, his voice cracking on her name. She did not look at him. If she looked at him, she would not be able to leave, and she had to leave because the Dowager was right. Every word of it. She was a merchant's daughter in a borrowed dress in a borrowed house, and the longer she stayed, the more damage she would do to a man who had already lost too much. She went upstairs and packed. She left the sapphire gown, the dove gray silk, the silver comb, every beautiful thing that had never really been hers. She kept only her mother's pearls and the leather portfolio of documents. She wrote one letter to the Duke and placed it on the writing desk. "Your Grace, I am returning to my family. This arrangement has served its purpose, and I believe it is best for everyone that it ends before more harm is done. Please do not look for me. Yours, Rowena Ashwick, Nell cried. L'Oreal was not told until after Rowena had gone, which was a cowardice she acknowledged and accepted. She climbed into the hired carriage and watched Thornfield House grow smaller through the rear window until it disappeared behind a corner, and with it, every impossible thing she had allowed herself to want. Home smelled of bread and soap and the particular quiet of a house where hope had been rationed for years. Margot Ashwick embraced her daughter without questions, which was its own form of kindness. Jasper arrived that evening, guilt and relief competing across his features in equal measure. Her father's empty chair sat in the corner of the parlor where it always sat, still bearing the impression of the man who had occupied it. 3 days passed. Rowena mended stockings, swept floors, read to her mother in the evenings. She did not open the leather portfolio. She did not think about the Duke, except constantly in the spaces between every thought, like a heartbeat she could not quiet. On the 4th day, Dermot Selkirk knocked at the door. "Miss Ashwick," he said, and for once his expression held no calculation. "Just urgency." "The Duke sent me. I don't want to hear it. He's dismissed Lady Clarice publicly. Told his grandmother he will not marry for suitability. He's been locked in his study since you left, refusing meals, refusing visitors. L'Oreal says she's never seen him like this. Then he'll recover. Dukes recover. They have the resources for it." "He's also done something else," Dermot said carefully. "He's contacted a solicitor about your father's documents. He's opening a formal investigation into the original land sale, at his own expense, against his own family's interests." Rowena went very still. "He said to tell you," Dermot continued, "that the truth matters more than the title, and that your father was right." The kitchen was silent. Margot Ashwick stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes bright with tears she would not shed. "Your father spent 20 years trying to be heard," Margot said softly. "And this man you're running from is the one who finally listened. I'm not running." "You're hiding, Rowena. There's no shame in being afraid. But there's grief in letting fear make your choices." Rowena looked at her mother, at Jasper, who for once said nothing, at the empty chair where her father had sat, night after night, surrounded by papers no one would read, fighting a battle no one believed in. "One conversation," she said to Dermot, "and then I'm done." He nodded, and something in his expression suggested that he did not believe the second part of that sentence any more than she did. The carriage was waiting. Rowena put on her coat and walked out of the cottage and into the uncertain light of a London afternoon, carrying nothing but her mother's pearls and the leather portfolio and the terrifying suspicion that she was about to do something irreversible. Thornfield House was the same and entirely different. The servants greeted her with startled warmth. Nell appeared at the top of the stairs and burst into tears. L'Oreal came flying down the corridor and seized her in an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked them both to the floor. "You came back," L'Oreal said, half laughing and half crying. "He's been impossible. Absolutely impossible. He won't eat, he won't sleep, he just sits in the library with those wretched account books and pretends he's functioning. Where is your grandmother?" "In her sitting room, pretending none of this is happening," which is her way of acknowledging that she was wrong without actually saying the words. "And Caius?" "Library," L'Oreal said. "Where else?" The library door was closed. Rowena stood before it for a long moment, her hand on the handle, feeling the weight of everything that waited on the other side. She opened the door. He was standing by the window, not sitting, not working, just standing, the way she had seen him in the garden that first night, his hands behind his back, his face turned toward the fading light. He looked wrecked, unshaven, coatless, dark circles under his eyes, every line of careful control dissolved into raw exhaustion. When he heard the door, he turned. Rowena, her name in his mouth sounded like the end of something and the beginning of something else. "You came back," he said. Dermot is very persuasive when he's not being infuriating. A ghost of a smile. Then it vanished, replaced by an intensity that pinned her in place. "I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." She nodded. He crossed the room to her, took her hands. His grip was shaking, and the tremor undid her more than any words could have, because this man did not tremble. This man controlled everything, his estates, his expression, his grief. And here he was, shaking. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you stood in an auction house and negotiated terms with me as if you were my equal, because you are my equal. I have loved you since you told my grandmother the truth about your father, when a lie would have been easier. I have loved you since you sat in my library and told me I was avoiding my grief, because no one else in my life has the courage to say what's real." "Caius," she started. "I'm not finished." He tightened his grip. "I contacted a solicitor. Your father's documents, the gaps in the records, the concealed entailment. I've instructed a full investigation. Whatever the findings are, they will be made public. If your family was cheated, the Wyndham estate will make restitution. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what society says. Your father spent his life fighting for the truth, and he deserved better than to die unheard." Rowena's eyes burned. "You could lose everything. I've already lost everything that matters once. When my father died. When I arrived 4 hours too late, and the sheets were already changed." He drew a ragged breath. "I will not lose you the same way. Not by arriving too late. Not by being too careful, too controlled, too afraid to choose what I actually want. What do you want? You. Here. Not as an arrangement. Not as a performance. As my partner. My equal. The person who makes me present in my own life. I want to stop performing duty and start living, and I want to do it with you." She was crying. She had not realized she was crying until she felt the tears on her hands where they gripped his. "Your grandmother will never forgive this. My grandmother will adapt. She always does. She'll disapprove loudly, and then ensure that everyone who insults you regrets it. That's how she loves. And society? Society can watch." She laughed through the tears, and the sound cracked something open in both of them. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying very hard not to, because loving you was never part of the agreement. But you gave me my father's truth without being asked. You believed him when no one else would. And that," she pressed her forehead to his, "that is worth more than any title, or fortune, or borrowed dress in existence." He kissed her, and this time there was no conservatory, no glass walls, no audience, just the library, their library, and the fire burning low, and the feeling of two people who had been carrying impossible weights finally setting them down. When they parted, he said, "We need to speak to my grandmother. Now. Now. If we're doing this, we do it properly." They found the dowager in her sitting room, embroidery untouched in her lap, staring at the wall with an expression that suggested she had been rehearsing this conversation for days. "So," the dowager said when they entered, "the prodigal returns." "Your Grace," Rowena said, stepping forward. "May I speak?" The dowager's eyebrow rose. She gestured permission. "You told me I was a merchant's daughter, playing at something beyond my station. You were right. I am a merchant's daughter. My father built something from nothing and lost it to a betrayal he spent his life trying to prove. I have no fortune. I have no title. I have no grand connections. By every measure this world uses, I am unsuitable." She paused, drew a breath. "But I love your grandson. Not his title, not his houses, not his wealth. I love the man who reads Cowper in the evening and stands alone in the garden because he doesn't know how to grieve in front of people. I love the man who gave me documents that could damage his own family because he believed my father deserved justice. I love him, and if you let me, I will spend the rest of my life making sure he knows he is more than a duty to be performed." The Dowager was silent for a very long time. Then she said, "Your father came to see me once. Did you know that?" Rowena shook her head. 3 years before he died, he sat in this room and told me he had proof that the original sale was fraudulent. He was calm, methodical, and entirely reasonable. He asked me to look at his evidence. I refused. I told him the matter was settled and his accusations were unwelcome. The Dowager's hands tightened on her embroidery frame. I was wrong to refuse him. I knew it then, and I know it now. Your father deserved to be heard, and I chose the comfort of silence over the discomfort of truth. That is not a mistake I intend to repeat." She stood. "I don't approve of this match. I think it will cause scandal, hardship, and endless difficulty. You will be scrutinized. You will be mocked. Some doors will close permanently. I understand, Your Grace, but I will not oppose it, and anyone who speaks against you in my hearing will discover precisely how much influence a Dowager Duchess still commands." She crossed the room, took Rowena's face in both hands, studied it for a long moment, and then released her with a nod that carried the weight of surrender, and, beneath it, something that might have been relief. "You have his stubbornness," the Dowager said. "Your father's. It will serve you well. You'll need it." The Redmond Assembly was the final event of the season, and all of London knew what was coming. Rowena stood at the top of the staircase in a gown of deep emerald silk that the Dowager herself had commissioned. "If you insist on making a spectacle," the old woman had said tartly, "at least make it a beautiful one." The ballroom below blazed with candlelight and expectation. Every face was turned upward, watching, waiting. "Ready?" Caius murmured beside her. Not remotely. He smiled. A real smile. The rarest thing in his repertoire, and she had caused it. They descended together. The whispers rose like a tide. Rowena saw Lady Clarice standing with her mother, her expression carefully blank. Saw the matrons who had gossiped about her at the musical. Saw Dermot lurking near the refreshments with Jasper, both of them watching with undisguised fascination. The Duke led her to the center of the floor. The orchestra had been playing, but the music faded as the room realized what was happening. Silence spread outward from where they stood, absolute and charged. "Miss Rowena Ashwick," the Duke said, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. "You walked into my life through an auction house and refused to be anything other than exactly who you are. You challenged me. You frightened me. You made me want to be present in a life I had been sleepwalking through. You are the bravest person I have ever known, and I am done pretending that what I feel for you is an arrangement." He reached into his coat and produced a ring, a sapphire flanked by diamonds, the Thornfield betrothal ring that L'Oreal had whispered about with reverent excitement. He dropped to one knee. The ballroom gasped as a single organism. "Will you marry me? Not because it's suitable, not because it's expected. Because I love you, and I choose you, and I want the rest of my life to begin now." Rowena looked down at him, at the Duke of Thornfield, on his knees, before 600 witnesses, offering her everything his title commanded and everything his heart contained. She thought of her father, who had spent his life asking to be believed. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to stand, as if the ground were honored to hold her. She thought of every door that had closed, every whisper she had endured, every moment she had been told to know her place. "Yes," she said. Her voice rang clear across the silent room. 1,000 times. "Yes." He stood and kissed her in front of everyone. The crowd erupted, applause and gasps and scandalized murmurs colliding in a wave of sound that crashed over them both. When they parted, Rowena caught the dowager watching from the edge of the ballroom. The old woman's expression was complicated: disapproval and resignation, and pride, and, unmistakably, a single tear tracking down her lined cheek before she brushed it away with imperial efficiency. She nodded once. It was enough. 6 months later, Rowena stood in the Thornfield House library with a solicitor's letter in one hand and her father's portfolio in the other. The investigation was complete. The findings were definitive. The original entailment had been valid. The maternal inheritance line had been deliberately obscured by Wyndham solicitors 60 years ago to facilitate a sale that should never have occurred. The Ashwick family's claim to the estate was legitimate. Edwin Ashwick had been right. Rowena read the letter twice, then set it down on the desk, beside a smaller envelope she had found that morning, tucked between the pages of the Cowper volume, the one she had borrowed from this library on her 4th night in this house, and never returned. The envelope was addressed to Caius in his father's handwriting. She had not opened it. She waited. When Caius entered the library that evening, she handed him both the solicitor's letter and the envelope. He read the legal findings first, nodding slowly as if he had expected them. Then he opened his father's letter. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then you have found what I could not bring myself to reveal while I lived. The Ashwick claim is real. I verified it myself years ago through private investigation. I should have made it public. I should have corrected the injustice our family perpetuated. But I was afraid of the scandal, afraid of what it would cost us, afraid of your grandmother's reaction. I chose comfort over truth, and I have carried that shame to my grave. Do not make my mistake. Do not choose safety when justice is available. The title, the estates, the reputation, none of it matters if it is built on a lie. Be braver than I was. Be the man I should have been. With all my love, your father." Caius sat down slowly in the leather chair by the fire. The letter trembled in his hands. "He knew," Caius said quietly. "All along. He knew, and he couldn't face it." Rowena knelt beside his chair and took his hand. He faced it in the end. "He left the evidence for you to find. He trusted you to do what he couldn't. My father was a good man who was afraid of the truth, and your father was a brave man that no one believed. They both deserved better." They sat together in the library, surrounded by books and firelight, and the ghosts of fathers who had failed and loved and tried, in their flawed and human ways, to leave something better behind. After a long time, Caius pulled Rowena into his arms and held her against his chest. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For walking into that auction house, for refusing to be quiet, for being brave enough to love someone who had forgotten how." Rowena pressed her face into his shoulder. "You taught me something too," she said. "I spent my whole life believing that my place was wherever other people decided to put me, that I should be grateful for what I was given and never reach for more. You showed me that knowing your place means choosing it, not accepting what the world assigns you, but standing where you belong and refusing to move." Outside the library windows, London hummed with its endless noise and motion. Inside, the fire crackled, and the books kept their patient watch, and the Duke of Thornfield held his duchess, and wondered how he had ever thought that duty alone could constitute a life. The solicitor's findings were published the following month. The scandal was extraordinary and brief. The Wyndham estate made full restitution to the Ashwick family. Jasper used his share to establish a legitimate shipping concern that, against all expectation, prospered. Margot Ashwick wore her pearls to the ceremony where her daughter became a duchess, and she wept openly, and no one thought less of her for it. The dowager continued to express pointed opinions about propriety, though she also ensured that anyone who slighted Rowena found themselves excluded from every event worth attending. Dermot Selkirk became the family's unofficial consultant for matters requiring discretion. Caius kept him on a short leash. Dermot pretended not to notice, and every year, on the anniversary of their engagement, Caius and Rowena returned to the auction house in Cheapside, where they had first met. They walked through the room together, not buying, not selling, and just standing in the place where everything had begun. And every year, Rowena would find something small, a book, a trinket, a piece of someone else's history, and Caius would buy it for her without being asked, because he understood now what her father had understood all along, that the things we save are the things that save us. And that knowing your place is not about where you stand. It's about who you stand beside. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist, because you believe in love that fights for truth, in characters who refuse to be silent, in endings that are earned through courage, not convenience. Your presence makes this space warm and welcoming, and I am grateful for every moment you spend with these characters. Consider subscribing if you would like more stories with emotional depth and genuine heart. Thank you for being here. You make this community what it is.